Awesome. Wonderful. Okay. So yeah, today thank you so much for joining my presentation. Today, we're going to be looking specifically at trauma and the adult brain. And I'd like to thank you all for so much for taking the time out of your evening to show up on this Thursday at 6 p.m. And I hope that there's something in this lesson that really empowers you. So I'd first like to begin this session by acknowledging that I am hosting this on the traditional and unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nations. My name is Lauren. I am enrolled in both the professional instructor diploma and the teaching online certificate. So kind of that blended approach to the two programs right now at VCC. And outside school, I am employed with Blue Shore Financial as a learning and development specialist. So in my role right now, I'm really focused on developing and evaluating courses from a lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in this, I spend a really good chunk of my time researching and making recommendations. And the topic of trauma has started to arise, and I felt it was really important to address, which is why I've thrown it together in a presentation here. In addition to this, I have spent most of my childhood and well into my adulthood playing contact sports, and many of these have resulted in head trauma. And unfortunately, I've had many symptoms that have really put a damper on my post-secondary education experience when I was a bit younger. And upon reflecting on a lot of this research, I can definitely see that that still rings true. So before discussing trauma, I think it's really important to note the areas of the brain that can be impacted through varying traumatic experiences, both in childhood and adulthood. So first, we've got our prefrontal cortex there highlighted in the green. And this area of the brain is really what controls the actions and thoughts of the amygdala. So danger or trauma that impacts the prefrontal cortex can cause long-term damages and challenges to the mental state, as its main role is in performing cognitive functions and communicating with the amygdala. The second part, kind of tucked in the middle there, is the amygdala. And this is considered the emotional center, one that regulates that fight or flight response, and it's really designed to detect danger. And studies have shown that in childhood trauma, there can be an effect to the size of the amygdala volume, which will look at things like reduced cognitive performance in all stages of life. And last but not least, we're going to be focusing on the hippocampus. So this area of the brain is really responsible as the learning and memory center, which can be greatly indicative of both short and long-term memory. And if a hippocampus is impacted, a person's situational awareness can be inhibited by putting them in a state of emotional, physical, or mental danger. Okay. So up on the screen here, I've listed some types of trauma that could impact a child or adult brain. Research in 2021 suggests that trauma can be experienced both directly and indirectly. So directly meaning that the event occurred firsthand, and indirectly meaning that a person may have witnessed a traumatic event, but not been directly involved with it. We also look at violence as a type of trauma, and this can be any type of violence that was, again, either witnessed or by direct exposure. Natural disasters are considered a type of trauma. So this will often spark post-traumatic stress disorder and other emotional impacts. An example of an adult that may have been traumatized by natural disasters, sorry about the fire engine, would have been some of those that were impacted in those 2015 earthquakes that went through Nepal, killing over 9,000 and injuring thousands more. We also look at interpersonal conflict as a type of trauma. So that nasty boss that you may have had threaten you to lose your job multiple times, this trauma can invoke fear in that amygdala, the center part of the brain, and cause long-due relationship stress that could impact your relationship with future employers. Your brain's way of protecting itself is to avoid disappointing your leader and avoiding that termination. We also look at sport or activity related, so maybe a bit more of a physical trauma to the brain. So one of the most controversial sports leagues recently terminated a physician based on their recommendation to allow a player to return to the field 1 week after a concussive event. The NFL has been under siege for years to reform play to look at how they're protecting their players from developing chronic traumatic encephalopathy, otherwise known as CTE, which is known to severely impact cognitive function and quality of life immediately, and also, unfortunately, in quite young adult players. We also look at neglect as a type of trauma. So Johnson suggests that childhood trauma, or childhood neglect rather, is a possible traumatic event that can lead to either minimal or catastrophic impact on adult relationships and specifically learning. So some of the students in your classrooms may never share symptoms of neglect, although they're likely to display behaviors that would be linked to shield trauma in childhood. We also look at intergenerational trauma. So unfortunately, the impact of colonialism in Canada has had long-lasting negative impact on the Indigenous peoples. The fatal combination of residential schools, the Indian Act, the White Paper of 1969, and many other factors have really contributed to generations of upheaval and trauma. And in a recent study performed in the University of Saskatchewan, Lindstrom discovered that there was a clear trend between trauma and Indigenous students studying in post-secondary institutions. We also look at life-threatening health conditions. So this can be either a type of trauma that you impact directly that can touch both emotional, physical, and or mental portions of your body. It can also be life-threatening health conditions that impact somebody greatly that you love or that you are close to. And the last type of trauma that we are going to be focusing on is terrorism and threats of terrorism. So this can be really prevalent with the globalization of learning and the access to wider ranges of people that are involved in either formal or informal learning through things like the MOOCs, so open online courses, as well as the delivery of online courses or programs. Okay. But before we dig into trauma specifically in the adult classroom, it's key to understand there are some statistics that it targets no one, but also impacts everyone. Based on a study conducted by Education Northwest, more than half the learning population in the United States is impacted by trauma at some point in their life that lead to challenges learning as an adult. We often see the transition of secondary to post-secondary as that next biggest step in adulthood. And for many, this could mean uprooting your home, moving away from your friends and family, learning to care for yourself, and navigating a new education experience. In the midst of the big change, it's estimated that as many as 50% of college students are exposed to a traumatic event within their first year of college, whether again, indirectly or directly. When we speak to the risk of trauma occurring in those ethnic minority and low socioeconomic status, it can refer back to where trauma can originate, but also perpetuate. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic brought a rash of racially motivated crimes against the Asian population, and it brought fear and pain to those that were targeted and people that felt they fit that demographic. In addition, it's crucial to note that everyone at some point in their life will carry an unconscious bias, and without awareness to those thoughts or actions, it's likely the judgment or action can be taken towards somebody with a low socioeconomic status or ethnic background. Another interesting finding was that trauma effects are commonly misdiagnosed in children and adults. The increase of attention deficit hyperdisorder, or ADHD, and subsequent prescription of Ritalin reached its height of popularity in 1990s. While many parents began to associate things like mood disorders, lack of concentration, and behavioral changes to medical diagnoses, the symptoms of trauma became diluted. So while many of these diagnoses absolutely ring true, it's important to recognize that even today, incorrect diagnoses can be made based on the presentation of relevant symptoms, which connect back to many learning disabilities. So I've listed up on the screen here some of the behaviors or traits that you may see students exhibit in the classroom. So blame, guilt, depression, safety concerns, inability to trust, disassociation, poor concentration, perhaps some substance abuse, eroded self-confidence or self-esteem, and chronic absenteeism. So various symptoms and behaviors can arise in adult learners based on the severity and type of trauma that's endured along with the developmental stage as to when the trauma occurred. As instructors, it's not our role to approach a learner nor make judgments about their past events and how it impacts their learning. However, it's important to constantly address psychological safety and host that environment that caters to a wide array of backgrounds and experiences. Research shows that students can exhibit varying degrees of symptoms, and that a comprehensive list is really challenging to address as it boils down to how the regions of the brain comprehend trauma and the severity it chooses to store. Acknowledging the symptoms of trauma can be present in learners is one way to tailor activities, coursework, coaching, feedback in an equitable manner that really supports that diverse group of learners and doesn't single out somebody who's had a traumatic experience in their life. Okay. So what does trauma look like? This is just two examples. So the photo on the left represents a brain scan of two individuals. So the left one with PTSD, a combat war veteran that was struggling with PTSD. The image shows apparent damage to the receptors in the brain that greatly impact the person's ability to regulate mood and is more likely to fall into a depressive state. A study was conducted through Yale University where I sourced this image in search of a prescription development for patients with severe PTSD. And right now, the challenge is that there's two current medications that are approved by the FDA, but the low dose that is approved is not powerful enough to treat the symptoms of PTSD, which is why that is continuing. On the right, we look at a traumatic brain injury, commonly referred to as TBI, so any kind of physical impact that would occur to the brain. This again represents two individuals. The brain on the left is a 38-year-old woman with no head trauma, and that yellow arrow towards the center of the brain indicates a clear tract of white matter separating the left and the right brain. The brain on the right is that of a 25-year-old who was involved in a motor vehicle crash where he sustained significant head trauma. The level of damage causes swelling in the brain and the confusion of enzymes and cells to a point where they become disconnected. And you'll see that in that white area in the middle. In a case like this, it's common that signs of trauma would become more evident in their behaviors and often actually lead to a higher risk of addiction in individuals like this. So this may be the first time you've thought about how trauma truly impacts your learners or your classroom. Perhaps this is already a foundational part of your curriculum and you found yourself here today to expand your thinking and hopefully take at least one idea back to your learning. You may have heard the word trauma-informed. This is often used in the medical care fields with extra emphasis on mental health workers. This could also be another one of those buzz terms that you know nothing about, but feel there might be a level of importance behind it. Regardless of whether you know the term or not, I've done a lot of research for you, and you can make the decision on whether this is applicable to your set of learners. As you hear some of the recommendations, remember that trauma can vary in levels and present in many ways. By engaging with trauma-informed practices, you're holding the key to a safe space for your group of learners and have the potential to reshape their belief on learning. So I deeply encourage you to spend some time researching and reading what it means to be a trauma-informed educator. In understanding the gravity of trauma at any stage in life, you can strive towards creating that equitable environment for your learners. Education Northwest recommends to practice cultural humility. So connect with learners based on a blended approach that is engaging to multiple ways of thinking and learning. For example, culture and education for Indigenous peoples was passed through generations through storytelling and hands-on experience. think about the methods and bringing these ways of learning into your activities and assignments. In practicing cultural humility, you are somebody who's constantly seeking education opportunities to grow your knowledge and your skill set. Johnson also recommends looking at course delivery and investing in integrating strategies that will address things like attention, memory, and mindfulness to really ground learning and support psychological safety. By adjusting activities to connect with the mind, body, and spirit, you can really open up opportunities for learners to gain trust and maybe redevelop that love of learning. By using your resource center, you can inspire yourself and others to acknowledge all perceived and experienced boundaries to learning. Seek out and share resources with your group of colleagues or to other professionals. In sharing, you're creating that network of people who can continue to evolve the trauma-informed adult education experience. This can include having your peers review proposed courses and assignments from a trauma-informed lens and openly providing access to things like mental health and counseling resources to both your peers and your learners. Lastly, modeling behaviors you wish to see and support can create a caring space. Treat students respectfully and reinforce your true belief in their capability to learn. Make health a priority. Openly share resources and suspend your judgment. By establishing and maintaining clear professional boundaries, remember you're not there to fix their trauma, you're there to support the learning experience for everyone. The next thing that I want to look at are two specific learning theories, the first being the Connectivism learning theory. So this was first developed in 2004 by George Siemens, and it was depending upon the education professional or researcher that you encounter, different beliefs will really come up around this theory. I've chosen to meaningfully bring this forward to the discussion of trauma and the learning experience based on 2 of the 8 principles that are offered within the Connectivism theory. So first, learning and knowledge rests in the diversity of opinion. And second, nurturing and maintaining connections is needed to facilitate conceptual learning. If we look at some of the recommendations brought forward thus far regarding honoring diversity and trauma in the classroom, these 2 principles absolutely ring true. We've come to recognize that diversity is prevalent in the adult classroom, regardless of traumatic background, and should be used to enhance connection to learning outcomes and to others enrolled in the course or program. UTech and Keller share that the landscape is ever changing and that in today's environment, healthy collaboration takes work to care, to create, nurture, and maintain connections. Related back to some of the symptoms of trauma, like inability to trust and safety concerns, taking the time to help thoughtfully bridge connections in the learning environment can really support a feeling of belonging and elevate that sense of psychological safety. Many recommendations arise from the Connectivism learning theory for online coursework, including the introduction of collaboration tools like Google Drive, Microsoft Teams, and video meeting tools like today. While all these tools are meant to drive connectivity between learners, it's important as an educator to continually set the stage to provide expectations and examples on professional, caring, and open dialogue between learners when they collaborate in and out of a formal learning environment. The next learning theory that is linked quite frequently to trauma within the classroom is the transformative learning theory. So this was largely due to the fact that learning is interpreted in a multitude of ways and impacted based on the level and depth of trauma present at any point in life. So Mesereau proclaims that every individual has a particular view of the world. And while many criticisms have evolved around the transformative learning theory, there are some really positive beliefs in advocating for change that has come from the initial introduction and study of this theory. Stephen Brookfield notes that in order for implementation and success of this theory, more cross-cultural perspectives are needed to break that Eurocentric and North American dominance in research. This ties back directly to the instructor's awareness of ethnic and socioeconomic biases and experience that shape trauma in the adult learning experience. When Mesereau originally proposed this learning theory in 1978, it was summarized as a transformative learning theory that deals with a learning process in which adults examine meaningful perspectives via a process of critical reflection, resulting in transformation of perspectives. As you can see, that would be a great way for somebody to reflect on their behaviors and patterns and to support them moving positively through a learning environment. In a study conducted in South Africa, it was highlighted that dealing with trauma in the adult learning context can not only be challenging for learners, but it can present challenge for instructors carrying personal trauma. It's often suggested that educators should have access to tools and resources to address trauma recovery in order to become an effective instructor. Okay. So I've just thrown a couple little key takeaways from the presentation. So again, learning to practice humility and continuing to learn and grow your toolkit as an educator to mitigate those negative impacts of trauma. Focusing and facilitating an environment that hosts psychological safety. That, remember, 50% of first-year college students, and even more with those that come from an ethnic background or low socioeconomic status, will have an impact of trauma in their life, and that there's varying degrees, and it's not our role to, as instructors, to look at these symptoms. We're there to create a safe environment. So that is kind of the end of the presentation, but I wanted to just open it up to all of you. If you have any feedback for me, any comments, or any questions that you'd like to ask.
Well done, Lauren. Sounds like you really know your stuff.
Thanks, Debbie.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that. It's a lot of information,
Mm-hmm.
and something I'm not too familiar with. So that was really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I enjoyed it thoroughly. And I was really interested to see, I found it interesting, the connections to what I think instructors can do without, like, to be a trauma-informed instructor without really going outside of what we might consider already as effective instructors, like creating a safe place, keeping in mind like the statistic of first-year college students. I'm thinking of, like, you know, campus assaults. I bet it's even higher, and like that should absolutely be in the mind of instructors, especially because it is so prevalent in that first year of college. Is so important and so new for those students. And then I'll just say one other thing that was particularly interesting was right near the end, you said something about trauma recovery for instructors and how that may tie in to be able to recover or work through some of the trauma that instructors might be carrying, maybe even unconsciously. To then therefore become an even more effective instructor. I thought that was quite interesting and gave me some things to think about.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks, Ashley.
Yeah, thanks again.
I'll just speak to it slightly. I teach in a nursing faculty, and our institution has actually come to the Health and Human Services Department and told us that the number of our students in counseling is much higher. So that we kind of had a debrief in a meeting about why that might be. And what they had determined was that it's likely that our faculty is more trauma informed and can see the behaviors because we're so used to seeing it within our bedside population that we once worked with or so on. So they were kind of wondering, like, is it our program that is traumatic and causing them to go to counseling, or are we better trained in the trauma informed aspect of things to have our numbers in the counseling service provided by our college be that much higher? So I think it's super important for like all domains and all faculties to be informed on it, because like you said, it's not just 50% of first year nursing students, it's 50% of first year college students that are experiencing that. So it's kind of interesting and just like speaks to the volume of how important this topic is.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tony. Any other questions or feedback at all? Okay. Perfect. Well, I will be posting this to Zoom for all of you to review if there's anything you kind of wanted to pick out from the future, along with a pretty extensive list of references that I was building up until yesterday. So I will make sure that I post those in the forum for you to all view. And I definitely recommend reading some of the articles because there is some really, really fantastic information in there, specifically around if you're looking to engage more of this with your practice. Awesome.